Send the maid away. Duchess Corian's voice sliced through the candlelit dining hall like a blade drawn slowly across silk. 30 guests froze mid-conversation, while wine glasses hovered untouched between gloved fingers. Isanora stood near the far wall, holding a silver tray of warm sugared pears, her hands trembling slightly beneath the weight. Vashien leaned forward from the table, smirking beneath her pearl earrings. Honestly, Mother, she should have been dismissed years ago. She frightens the newer staff with her silence. Nerys tilted her head with practiced pity. Perhaps a workhouse placement would suit her better. At least there, she would be among equals. Soft laughter rippled across the guests. Andrin, the youngest, adjusted her diamond bracelet without looking up. I simply find it strange that a household of our reputation still keeps someone so plainly unsuitable. People notice these things. Duchess Corian set down her crystal glass with a sharp tap against the oak table. I have tolerated this long enough. She brings nothing to this estate. She possesses no skill worth preserving, no family worth mentioning, and no future worth protecting. I want her removed before the week ends. The dining hall fell completely silent. Every guest turned toward Isanora. Heat crawled painfully across her face, while the silver tray shook visibly in her grip. Then, just as Isanora lowered her eyes and stepped backward toward the servants' corridor, the heavy doors of the dining hall opened with a slow, deliberate force that silenced even the crackling fireplaces. Duke Leoric Ashvane stood in the doorway. His dark coat carried traces of rain from the long ride back to the estate, and his expression held the kind of stillness that made powerful men cautious. His gaze swept the frozen room before landing directly upon his mother. She stays. 2 words. The entire hall stopped breathing. Corian's composure cracked for barely a moment before she recovered. Lyric, this matter does not concern your sentiment. This is a household decision. Lyric stepped further into the room, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that pressed against every wall. Before this evening ends, every person in this room will understand exactly why Isanora can never be sent away from this estate. And when you do, Mother, you will wish you had never spoken those words aloud. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, and powerful moments of truth, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use super thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us continue. 5 years earlier, on a frozen morning when ice clung to every window of Thornhaven Manor, a girl of 19 arrived at the servants' entrance carrying nothing but a small leather case held together with fraying string. Nobody greeted her. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Aldara, looked her over once without warmth and handed her a gray wool dress, a white apron, and a list of duties longer than her arm. Top floor corridors swept and polished before dawn. Fireplaces cleared and reset in 12 rooms before breakfast. Linens pressed, silver cleaned, guest chambers inspected before midday, kitchen assistance until supper. Candles replaced throughout the east and west wings before nightfall. Isanora asked no questions. She changed into the servant's dress behind a storage cupboard, folded her old clothes carefully into the leather case, and began working before the sun had finished rising. That was 5 years ago. Now, at 24, Isanora moved through Thornhaven Manor the way cold air moved through the cracks in old stone walls. Present everywhere, felt occasionally, noticed by almost nobody. She woke before the rest of the household each morning, while the sky outside remained dark purple above the hills. Her first task was always the grand corridor on the upper floor, where portraits of every Ashvane ancestor stretched across the walls in gilded frames nearly as tall as she was. She polished the marble floors on her knees with lemon oil until they reflected candlelight without a single streak. By the time the family stirred, Every fireplace in the manor was already crackling with fresh wood. Warm bread sat rising in the kitchen. Pressed tablecloths covered the breakfast table without a single crease. Fresh flowers stood arranged inside crystal vases throughout the drawing rooms. Nobody ever asked who had done these things. They simply expected them to exist, the same way they expected sunlight through windows or warmth from fire. Duchess Corian ran the household with the precision of a military commander and the warmth of a January frost. She moved through the corridors each morning, inspecting everything while 2 attendants followed behind her, carrying leather notebooks filled with complaints. A candle holder placed 3 inches too far left on a mantelpiece was enough to earn a servant a public scolding before the entire kitchen staff, yet she never once looked directly at Isanora while delivering criticism. She simply spoke about her, like someone who existed somewhere between furniture and air. Tell the girl, the west drawing room smells of damp wood. I will not tolerate it during Lady Fenwick's visit. The girl, all those years inside the household, and the Duchess had never once used her name. Vachien, the eldest of the Duke's 3 sisters, had married Lord Draven Calloway 2 years earlier. Despite living at the Calloway estate most of the year, she returned frequently to Thornhaven with sharp observations and sharper insults. Her favorite pastime involved finding flaws in Isanora's work and describing them loudly enough for guests to hear. Is this how linen is folded in proper households now? Vachien once asked during a luncheon while holding up a perfectly pressed napkin pretending it contained a stain visible only to her. Narration, the middle sister, preferred quieter cruelty. She rarely raised her voice, but her comments carried a precision designed to leave marks beneath the surface. You work so hard, Isanora, Narissa said one afternoon while passing her in the corridor. It must be comforting knowing your future requires nothing more than this. Andrine, the youngest at 20, held the least malice individually, but followed her sister's behavior the way water follows gravity. She laughed when they laughed. She looked away when they looked away. She repeated their words to friends as entertaining stories during garden parties. Yet, despite the daily cruelty, small moments revealed the person, Isanora, truly was beneath the plain dress and silence. One evening during a heavy rainstorm, Isanora discovered the elderly gardener, a quiet man named Halden, shivering inside the tool shed with a fever that had kept him working far too long in the cold. Instead of reporting him to the housekeeper, which would have cost him his position, Isanora brought him warm broth from the kitchen, wrapped a thick blanket around his shoulders, and covered his remaining duties herself before anyone noticed his absence. Halden recovered within days and never forgot what she had done. Another morning, a young kitchen girl named Tilly accidentally shattered an expensive porcelain serving bowl that belonged to the Duchess's personal collection. The child stood trembling beside the broken pieces, tears streaming silently down her face, knowing dismissal was certain. Isanora swept the fragments into her own apron, carried them to the waste bin outside, and told Aldara the bowl had slipped from her own hands during cleaning. She accepted the scolding without flinching, while Tilly watched from behind the pantry door with wide, disbelieving eyes. The servants noticed everything. They always did. She has more kindness in her smallest finger than that entire family carries between them, whispered old Brielle, the longest-serving maid in the household. One evening, while Isanora hung laundry beneath the stars, because the drying racks inside were full, Brielle had worked at Thornhaven for over 30 years and remembered a time before Isanora arrived, when the estate felt colder somehow despite fewer people suffering inside it. But kindness did not protect Isanora from the one thing she could never escape. Every quarter, Duchess Corian reviewed household expenses inside the study while her steward presented reports. During one of these reviews, Isanora carried a tea tray to the door and heard the Duchess speaking with chilling clarity. The girl adds nothing of measurable value. She works adequately, but any girl from the village could replace her within a week. I see no reason to continue carrying her as a permanent cost against this household. The steward hesitated before responding carefully. The Duke has previously indicated his preference that she remain, Your Grace. A long silence followed. My son's preferences regarding staffing are sentimental, not practical, and sentiment does not sustain estates. Isanora set the tray down silently outside the door and walked away before anyone discovered her listening. That night she sat on the edge of her narrow bed inside the small attic room she had slept in since her arrival. The ceiling sloped so low she could not stand fully near the walls. A single candle burned on the wooden shelf beside a small mirror with a cracked corner. She pressed her hands flat against her knees and stared at the floor for a very long time without crying. Tears had stopped coming easily years ago. Instead, a quieter feeling settled through her. The heavy, familiar understanding that she existed inside a house that would erase her without hesitation if one powerful woman simply decided she was no longer worth keeping. And somewhere, deep beneath that understanding lived a question Isanora had carried since the day she arrived at Thornhaven Manor. Why had the Duke's father brought her here at all? Andrine's engagement to Lord Keldon Trevar arrived like a storm the household had been anxiously awaiting for months. The announcement came during a private supper attended only by family members and 2 close associates of the Duchess. Andrine displayed the sapphire ring beneath the candlelight, while Corianne smiled wider than Isanora had ever witnessed in all her years at the estate. The Trevars are among the finest families in the southern counties, the Duchess declared proudly. This union secures precisely the kind of alliance Thornhaven deserves. Within days, the estate transformed entirely. Wagons arrived carrying crates of imported champagne, towers of white roses wrapped in silk ribbons, enormous rolls of ivory lace intended for the ballroom ceiling, and polished silver candelabras taller than most of the servants carrying them. The kitchens became overwhelming landscapes of heat and noise. Cooks worked through the night preparing roasted venison glazed with blackberry reduction, creamed parsnip soup, honey duck, spiced apple tartlets, lemon custard towers, and sugar-dusted pastries filled with rosewater cream. The scent of cinnamon, roasting meat, melted butter, and fresh bread drifted permanently through every corridor of the manor. Musicians arrived 3 days before the celebration and practiced orchestral arrangements inside the ballroom, while florists climbed ladders to weave white roses through the iron chandeliers above. Naturally, the burden of organizing everything fell upon Isanora. Duchess Corianne issued instructions through the housekeeper each morning, but the actual execution required someone willing to work from before dawn until well past midnight. Isanora supervised the florists, corrected table placements, managed disagreements between exhausted kitchen staff, inspected guest bedrooms for dust or imperfection, polished silver until her fingers ached beyond feeling, and carried heavy crates of glassware between the cellar and the ballroom until her shoulders burned constantly. She ate her own meals standing beside the kitchen doorway, usually cold bread and whatever broth remained at the bottom of the pot after the cooks had eaten. Not a single member of the Ashvane family acknowledged her effort. Not once. 3 days before the celebration, Isanora knelt on the ballroom floor at nearly midnight, carefully repairing a torn section of the ivory lace that had been draped across the ceiling beams. Her fingers were raw from hours of needlework. Her back ached from climbing ladders repeatedly throughout the day. The ballroom sat empty and dark except for 4 candles she had brought from the kitchen. Footsteps approached from the corridor. Andrine entered the ballroom wearing a silk dressing gown, followed by Nerys, who carried a glass of warm wine. They stopped when they noticed Isanora crouched on the floor, surrounded by pins and thread. Andrine tilted her head. "Are you still working?" Isanora kept her eyes on the lace. "The tear is nearly mended." Nerys sipped her wine slowly while studying Isanora, with the expression of someone watching a creature perform a trick slightly beneath their interest. "You know, Isanora, you genuinely have a talent for this. Mending, arranging, carrying. It suits you." Andrine giggled softly. Perhaps we should commission a small uniform with the Ashvane crest embroidered across the sleeve. Make it official." The laughter between them was quiet, but carried a casual cruelty sharpened over years of repetition. Isanora continued stitching, without responding. Nerys knelt slightly, bringing her face closer to Isanora's level. "Honestly, do you ever wonder what your life might have been if circumstances had been different?" The question sounded almost gentle, but the tone beneath it held something far colder. "I try not to think about things I cannot change," Isanora answered carefully. Nerys smiled. "Wise. Because nothing is going to change for you here." They left the ballroom together without saying goodnight. Isanora finished the repair alone by candlelight while the rest of the household slept. The evening of the engagement celebration arrived, beneath heavy gray clouds that pressed low across the hills surrounding Thornhaven. Despite the weather, the ballroom glowed magnificently. Hundreds of candles reflected against polished marble floors, while white roses cascaded from iron chandeliers above. Crystal glasses sparkled across long dining tables, covered in cream linen and gold-edged plates. The scent of roasted venison, honeyed duck, lemon custard, and warm bread filled every corner of the enormous room as guests began arriving in carriages that stretched along the gravel driveway. Isanora worked silently among the serving staff, carrying trays of champagne between guests dressed in velvet, silk, and diamonds. She wore the same plain gray dress she wore every day. Nobody looked at her directly. To the guests, she was simply another pair of hands, delivering glasses and clearing plates. Andrine looked radiant in a cream and gold gown that shimmered whenever she moved beneath the candlelight. Lord Kael'dan stood beside her with practiced ease, shaking hands with important men while Andrine received compliments from women who studied her ring with open admiration. Vashien had traveled from the Calloway estate specifically for the celebration and seated herself prominently near the head of the table, ensuring every guest understood her own marriage had come first and remained the family's foundational alliance. Duchess sat opposite, wearing emerald silk that caught the light in ways that drew constant attention. Duchess Corianne occupied the center of everything, directing conversation, managing introductions, and steering the evening's atmosphere with the precision of someone conducting an orchestra. During supper, Isanora moved carefully between tables, refilling glasses and replacing empty platters. She had nearly completed a full circuit of the ballroom without incident when an elderly baron seated near the window gestured toward her. "You there, girl. This wine has gone warm. Bring something chilled immediately." Isanora nodded and turned toward the serving corridor. But as she passed behind the Ashvane family table, Vashien suddenly extended her arm backward without looking, reaching blindly for a glass. Her elbow struck Isanora's tray sharply. 3 crystal glasses toppled sideways. Red wine spilled in a long crimson streak across the white linen tablecloth directly in front of the Duchess. The ballroom went quiet. Corianne stared at the spreading stain with an expression that could have frozen rivers. Then she looked up slowly at Isanora, who stood paralyzed, holding the now empty tray with both hands pressed white against the silver edges. Vashien turned around with wide, innocent eyes. "Oh dear, you must be more careful around proper gatherings, Isanora." Nerys shook her head with practiced disappointment. "This is precisely why household staff should remain near the kitchens during formal events." Andrine said nothing but covered her smile with a lace napkin. Isanora's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I am so sorry, Your Grace. I will clean this immediately." Corianne did not respond to her. Instead, she turned toward the housekeeper standing near the ballroom entrance and spoke with a clarity designed to reach every ear in the room. "Remove her from the dining service for the remainder of the evening. I will not have clumsy hands ruining my daughter's celebration." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few women whispered behind their fans, while Isanora carefully gathered the fallen glasses from the table, her fingers trembling so violently She nearly dropped him again. As she passed toward the servants' corridor, head lowered and chest burning with humiliation, she heard Vachien's voice behind her, bright and amused. "Do not worry, sister. Accidents happen. Some people simply were not made for rooms like this." Laughter followed Isanora through the door. She made it exactly 7 steps into the darkened corridor before her legs buckled. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and slid downward until she sat on the floor with the empty tray resting across her lap. No tears came. Instead, a single thought settled through her like a stone sinking into still water. 5 years. 5 years of silence, obedience, and invisible labor. And she still meant nothing more to this household than the stain she had just been blamed for creating. But somewhere above the ballroom, in a private study she had never been permitted to enter, a locked drawer held a letter bearing a wax seal that had not been broken in over 5 years. And the only person alive who knew its contents had just ridden through the rain toward Thornhaven Manor. Long before Isanora learned to move silently through the corridors of Thornhaven Manor, she had lived inside a very different house. Moorcaster Hall stood among rolling green hills in the western counties, smaller than the great aristocratic estates, but warmer than most of them combined. The walls were built from honey-colored stone that glowed amber during sunset, while ivy climbed across the eastern wing in thick green curtains that swayed gently during summer storms. Inside, bookshelves lined nearly every room. Music drifted from open windows most evenings, and laughter came easily, because Lord Gavrion Moorcaster believed a home without laughter was simply a building wearing a title it had not earned. Isanora adored her father beyond language. Gavrion was not a man built for politics or power games. He spoke softly, listened carefully, and treated every person who entered his household with the same steady respect, regardless of whether they arrived in a carriage or on foot. He taught Isanora to read before she turned 5, introduced her to philosophy before she turned 10, and spent long evenings walking beside the lake behind the estate, discussing ideas most fathers would never share with a daughter. "You will meet many people in your life who measure worth by what a person owns," he told her once while they sat beneath an enormous oak tree, watching the sun sink behind the hills. "But the only worth that survives anything is the kind that lives inside your character. Everything else can be taken from you, overnight." Isanora remembered those words, with painful clarity now, because everything else had been taken. Her mother, LOS, had died of fever when Isanora was 7. The grief nearly destroyed Gavrion, but he carried himself forward for his daughter's sake, pouring every fragment of love he possessed into raising her alone. For years they lived quietly and contentedly inside Moorcaster Hall, while the world beyond their gates grew louder, greedier, and more dangerous. Gavrion's closest friend during those years was Duke Aldwin Ashfane, Leoric's father. The two men had attended the same schools as boys, and maintained a deep bond throughout adulthood, built on mutual respect and shared values. Aldwin visited Moorcaster Hall frequently, sometimes bringing young Leoric along. Isanora remembered a serious, quiet boy of perhaps 12 sitting across the breakfast table from her, studying her with careful curiosity, while their fathers debated agricultural reform beside the fireplace. She could not recall whether they had ever spoken directly, but she remembered his eyes. Even then they carried something older than the face surrounding them. The destruction arrived without warning. During the autumn, Isanora turned 14. Lord Hareth Velmeyer, a powerful nobleman with vast political connections and a reputation for eliminating rivals through legal manipulation, accused Gavrion publicly of financial fraud involving forged investment documents connected to a trading company. The charges were entirely fabricated. Gavrion had never forged anything in his life, but Velmeyer possessed allies inside Parliament, influence over key magistrates, and enough wealth to sustain a legal assault that a modest nobleman like Gavrion could never withstand. The trial lasted 4 months. Gavrion sold nearly everything to fund his defense, while Isanora watched the household she loved dissolve around her. Servants were released one by one. Furniture was carried away by creditors. Rooms that once smelled of beeswax and lavender stood empty. While cold drafts blew through uncovered windows, Gavrion lost the case. His title was suspended pending further review. His estates were seized, and his name was destroyed across every social circle in England. But the cruelest blow came afterward. While traveling to London for a final legal appeal during a bitterly cold January, Gavrion collapsed from pneumonia worsened by months of exhaustion, poor nutrition, and grief. He died alone inside a rented room above a printing shop. Isanora was not permitted to see him before the end. A letter arrived at the temporary lodging, where she was staying with an elderly aunt, informing her that Lord Gavrion Morcaster had passed quietly during the night. She was 14 years old. She had no money, no estate, no family, and no legal name that carried anything except shame. For 5 years, Isanora lived with her elderly aunt in a cramped lodging house near the edge of a market town, surviving on whatever small income the old woman could manage. She worked wherever she could, washing clothes, mending fabric for local seamstresses, scrubbing floors in public houses. The world her father had built for her vanished completely, replaced by cold rooms, exhaustion, and the constant ache of remembering a life that no longer existed. Then, when Isanora was 19, the aunt fell gravely ill and could no longer care for herself, let alone provide shelter for anyone else. Isanora faced the prospect of true destitution for the first time. That same winter, a carriage bearing the Ashvane crest arrived outside the lodging house. A letter from Duke Aldwin Ashvane requested that Isanora be brought to Thornhaven Manor immediately. The old Duke met her personally inside the entrance hall. His face was lined with grief. She recognized instantly because it mirrored something living inside her own chest. "Your father was the finest man I ever knew," Aldwin told her quietly, while servants carried her small leather case upstairs. "What was done to him was a crime that law failed to prevent. I cannot undo it, but I can promise you a place inside this household for as long as you need one." Isanora did not cry that day. She had already used every tear her body could produce during those years with her aunt. Instead, she simply nodded and followed a housekeeper up the stairs toward a small attic room at the far end of the servants' corridor. The placement as a servant rather than a ward was Aldwin's attempt to shield her. Velmeyer's allies still held political influence, and a nobleman openly taking in the daughter of a disgraced lord would invite dangerous scrutiny. Hiding Isanora among the household staff kept her safe, but invisible. Aldwin intended the arrangement to be temporary. He planned to pursue legal restoration of Gavrion's name once political conditions shifted, but only months after Isanora's arrival, Aldwin suffered a sudden collapse in his study. He died within hours, leaving behind a grieving household, a young duke unprepared for the weight now resting on his shoulders, and a locked drawer inside his private desk containing a letter Isanora had never been told about. The last words Aldwin ever spoke to his son were recorded by the attending physician, who stood beside the bed. "Protect the girl, Leoric. Whatever happens, you gave me your word." Leoric was 25 years old when his father died. He inherited an enormous estate, a powerful title, a grieving mother who resented the burden of sudden widowhood, and a promise he did not yet fully understand, but intended to keep regardless. And downstairs, in a narrow attic room beneath a sloping ceiling, a girl of 19 wrapped her arms around her knees and lowered her forehead against them while the silence of the manor settled around her. She had now lost every person who had ever loved her. From outside the tall iron gates of Thornhaven, the Ashvane family appeared magnificent. 3 beautiful daughters married or engaged into powerful families. A young duke, commanding respect across England. A dowager duchess whose social authority rivaled that of women born into royal households. but cracks had begun spreading beneath every polished surface, and the servants always noticed first. Vashtienne's marriage to Lord Draven Calloway had been celebrated 2 years earlier, with enough champagne to fill the ornamental lake behind the estate. The wedding was described in London papers as a triumph of aristocratic alliance. Draven possessed an old family name, a sprawling country estate, and a smile that charmed every room he entered. What the papers never reported was the drinking. Within 6 months of the wedding, Vashtienne began returning to Thornhaven with increasing frequency, always offering the same brittle explanation. Draven is occupied with business in London. I thought Mother might enjoy the company. But old Brielle noticed things no polite guest would mention. She noticed the careful way Vashtienne applied powder beneath her left eye one morning before breakfast. She noticed how Vashtienne flinched slightly whenever a door closed too loudly nearby. She noticed that Vashtienne's expensive jewelry collection had been slowly shrinking over the past year, pieces disappearing one by one without explanation. One evening, while Isanora carried fresh towels to the guest wing, she passed Vashtienne's door and heard something that stopped. Her mid-step quiet, shaking sobs, muffled by a pillow pressed tightly against a face. The sound of someone crying who had trained herself never to cry where people could hear. Isanora stood outside that door for nearly a full minute. Every instinct told her to knock, to offer comfort, to do what she had always done for frightened kitchen girls and shivering gardeners, but Vashtienne had humiliated her publicly just 3 days earlier in front of 30 guests, and the memory of red wine spreading across white linen still burned inside Isanora's chest. She walked away quietly. Some doors were not hers to open. Nerissa's situation carried a different kind of poison. She had spent 2 seasons pursuing Lord Soren Marwick, a coldly handsome political figure with close ties to Parliament and a reputation for choosing relationships the way other men chose investments, based entirely on projected return. Nerissa believed she had secured his genuine affection after months of carefully managed appearances at London events. She dressed for him. She studied political topics. She found boring so she could contribute to conversations he cared about. She adjusted her personality so gradually that even she no longer remembered which version of herself was original and which had been constructed for his approval. Then, one afternoon, Isanora overheard Nerissa speaking with Duchess Corianne inside the morning room while delivering a tray of pressed lemon water. "He has not written in 11 days, Mother." Nerissa's voice carried a tightness that sounded painful even from behind the door. Corianne's response was immediate and cold. "Then, write to him first." Silence from a man of his position is not rejection. It is a test of patience. "I have written. Twice." He did not respond to either letter. A pause followed that lasted long enough to fill the room with something close to dread. "Then you must try harder." A woman who loses a man like Soren Marwick due to lack of persistence has only herself to blame. Isanora set the tray down outside the door and retreated. She recognized something in Nerissa's voice that she had never expected to hear there. Fear. Genuine, unguarded fear of being found unworthy by someone whose approval she had built her entire identity around. For a brief, strange moment, Isanora almost felt sympathy. Then she remembered Nerissa kneeling beside her on the ballroom floor just weeks ago, whispering with surgical calm that nothing was ever going to change for her. Sympathy faded quickly after that. Andrine's engagement to Lord Colden still glittered publicly, but the light behind it had already begun dimming. Colden was handsome, wealthy, and socially impeccable. He also possessed a need for control so absolute that even the Duchess occasionally fell silent when he corrected Andrine's behavior in company. During a supper gathering 3 weeks after the engagement celebration, Isanora watched from the serving corridor as Selden leaned toward Andrine and murmured something too quiet for other guests to hear. Whatever he said drained the color from Andrine's face completely. She set down her fork carefully and did not eat again for the remainder of the meal. Later that night, Andrine passed Isanora in the upstairs corridor. Without acknowledging her, But Isanora noticed her red-rimmed eyes, her trembling chin, and the way her hands clenched the fabric of her skirt trying to hold herself physically together. It was the first time Isanora had ever seen Andrine look fragile. Meanwhile, Duchess Coriane carried her own invisible burden with the rigid composure of a woman who believed showing weakness was identical to committing treason against her own bloodline. But late at night, after the household had retired and the corridors fell silent, Brielle sometimes found the Duchess sitting alone inside the study that had once belonged to Duke Goldwyn. She never spoke during these moments. She simply sat beside the cold fireplace, gazing at the empty chair across from her, waiting for someone who was never going to return. The old Duke's death had broken something inside Coriane that pride alone could not repair. She had loved Aldwyn deeply, even if she expressed love the way some people expressed disapproval, through control rather than warmth. His absence left a hollow space inside the household that she filled with authority, discipline, and an obsessive need to manage every detail of her children's futures, including deciding who deserved to remain under her roof. And with the engagement celebration now behind them, Coriane's attention turned once again toward the one matter inside Thornhaven that she considered unfinished. The girl in the worn wool dress who still had no family, no future, and no reason to remain. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning while rain fell steadily across the estate grounds. Isanora was polishing candlesticks inside the drawing room when Aldera, the head housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately unsettled her. "The Duchess wishes to see you. Immediately." Isanora set down the cloth carefully and followed Aldera through the corridors toward the morning room. Each step felt heavier than the last. In all her time at Thornhaven, Duchess Coriane had summoned Isanora directly fewer than a handful of times, and never once for pleasant conversation. Inside the morning room, Coriane sat behind a polished writing desk with a document resting beneath her fingertips. Pale gray light fell through the tall windows behind her, casting long shadows across the floral carpet. She did not invite Isanora to sit. She did not look up immediately. She allowed the silence to stretch until it became its own form of punishment. Then she spoke. "I have made arrangements with Mrs. Edders, Pemberton, who operates a respectable domestic staffing house in Caulfield. You will be transferred to her care at the end of this month. She will place you in a suitable household elsewhere." Isanora's chest tightened so suddenly she felt her breath catch painfully between her ribs. "Your Grace, I do not understand." Coriane looked up slowly, with the expression of someone explaining something very simple to someone very slow. "You have served this household adequately, Isanora. But circumstances require efficiency. Andrine's marriage will bring new staff arrangements. The household is being restructured. Your position is no longer necessary." The words sounded perfectly reasonable. Each one had been chosen to present the decision as administrative rather than personal. But Isanora understood the truth beneath them with devastating clarity. This was not a restructuring. This was an eviction. "May I ask whether the Duke has been informed of this decision?" Isanora's voice came out steadier than she expected. Something flickered across Coriane's face. Irritation, perhaps, or a flicker of warning. "My son is occupied with estate matters in London and will not return for several weeks. Household staffing decisions fall within my authority. They always have." Isanora stood perfectly still while the room seemed to tilt slowly beneath her feet. Years of labor, silence, and obedience condensed into a single administrative sentence. Position no longer necessary. "You are dismissed." Coriane returned her attention to the document beneath her hand. "Aldara will help you. Prepare your belongings." Isanora left the morning room without another word. She made it halfway down the servants' corridor before she had to stop walking because her legs refused to carry her further. She pressed one hand against the cold stone wall and breathed slowly until the trembling in her body reduced to something she could control. By evening, every servant in the household knew. News traveled through Thornhaven staff quarters the way heat traveled through iron. Brielle found Isanora sitting alone inside the laundry room, folding sheets by candlelight with mechanical precision, her face completely expressionless. "This is not right," Brielle whispered fiercely. "The old Duke would never have allowed this. The old Duke is gone, Brielle." Isanora's voice was quiet but carried a finality that silenced the older woman completely. That night, Isanora climbed the narrow staircase to her attic room and sat on the edge of her bed, while the rain continued falling outside the small window above her pillow. She opened the leather case, the same one she had arrived with, and began placing her few possessions inside it. 2 plain dresses, a wooden comb, a small book of philosophy her father had given her on her 12th birthday. A pressed flower she had kept from the gardens at Morchester Hall, now so dry it could crumble between careless fingers. Everything she owned in the world fit inside a case she could carry with one hand. The following days became an exercise in quiet erasure. The sisters learned of Isanora's pending departure and responded with reactions that revealed more about themselves than they likely intended. Vashien expressed satisfaction with a cruelty so casual it barely registered as intentional. "Honestly, it is overdue. The household will feel lighter without her constant hovering." Narration offered something shaped like sympathy, but constructed entirely from condescension. "I hope she finds a placement suited to her abilities. Not every household requires the same standards as Thornhaven." Andrine said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than either sister's response. 3 days before Isanora's scheduled departure, the household hosted a small afternoon tea for several of Corian's closest social acquaintances. Isanora was required to serve despite her impending dismissal because the replacement staff had not yet arrived. She carried trays of finger sandwiches, poured tea without trembling, and cleared plates with practiced invisibility, while women in expensive silk discussed matters she was expected to neither hear nor remember. Then Lady Ashworth, an elderly countess seated nearest the window, gestured toward Isanora while speaking directly to the Duchess. "Is this the girl you mentioned? The one being sent away?" Corian nodded with a tight, satisfied smile. "Yes. A necessary adjustment." Lady Ashworth studied Isanora the way someone might study a painting they were considering purchasing at a reduced price. She carries herself well enough, though one does wonder about her origins. "You say she arrived under unusual circumstances." Corian's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Something careful entered her voice. "My late husband brought her into the household years ago. A charitable gesture, but charity has its limits." "Indeed," Lady Ashworth agreed pleasantly. "One cannot carry every burden indefinitely." Isanora set down a teacup with perfect steadiness despite the fact that her hands wanted desperately to shake. She excused herself from the room without drawing attention and walked calmly through the corridor toward the kitchen. She made it past the pantry, past the scullery, past the boot room, and through the rear door into the cold afternoon air before anything inside her finally broke. She stood in the kitchen garden behind the manor, surrounded by wet rosemary and thyme bushes, and pressed both hands against her mouth while her body shook with sobs she refused to release as sound. Rain soaked through her dress within minutes. Her hair fell loose against her face. Her knees threatened to buckle against the muddy ground. This was the lowest moment. Not the cruelty, not the mockery, not the wine spilled across white linen, or the laughter echoing through candlelit ballrooms. This was being erased, calmly, administratively, and completely. As though years of devotion, labor, and silent endurance could be folded into a letter and posted to a staffing house in Caulfield without a single person in the family losing a moment of sleep. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for the rain to soak completely through every layer of clothing she wore. Long enough for the cold to settle deep inside her bones. Then, through the sound of falling rain, she heard something that made her lift her head slowly. Hooves on gravel. Moving fast, coming from the eastern road that led directly to Thornhaven's front gates, and old Brielle's voice, sharp and urgent, calling from the kitchen doorway behind her, "Isanora, come inside. Come inside right now." The Duke has returned. Leoric Ashvane had not always been a man who filled rooms with silence simply by entering them. At 20, before the title and the weight that accompanied it, Leoric had laughed easily. He rode horses recklessly across the northern hills. He debated philosophy with university friends, until candles burned to nothing on dining tables. He played cards badly and lost money cheerfully because the company mattered more than the outcome. His father, Duke Aldwin, recognized something valuable inside his son's openness and warned him gently, during one of their last conversations before illness took hold. "The world will try to harden you, Leoric. Let it sharpen you instead. There is a difference most men never learn." Leoric did not understand those words fully until Lady Caelith Danter entered his life one autumn evening at a London opera. Caelith possessed the beauty that rearranged rooms. When she entered, conversations paused. Women studied her with admiration that carried thin edges of envy, while men forgot whatever sentence they had been constructing mid-breath. Her dark hair fell in carefully arranged waves against ivory skin, and her voice carried a warmth so perfectly measured it felt like sunlight falling at exactly the right angle through a window. Leoric was captivated immediately and completely. Their courtship became the most discussed romance in London society within weeks. They attended the theater together. They walked through public gardens while newspaper illustrators sketched them from behind hedgerows. Leoric gifted her jewelry that could have purchased estates. He introduced her to his mother, who approved enthusiastically, because Caelith possessed precisely the social currency Corianne valued above all other qualities. "She is magnificent," Corianne told her son after their first meeting. "This is the woman Thornhaven deserves." For nearly a year, Leoric believed he had found something rare. Caelith listened to his thoughts with focused attention. She asked questions about his ambitions. She remembered small details from conversations held weeks earlier, and referenced them casually in ways that made him feel genuinely seen. He began discussing marriage openly. He instructed his solicitor to begin reviewing settlement documents. He even visited a jeweler in London who specialized in rings commissioned by noble families, spending 3 full hours selecting a stone he believed reflected something honest about what he felt. Then one evening, while arriving unexpectedly early to a private dinner at Caelith's family estate, Leoric entered the garden terrace and discovered her standing dangerously close to Lord Edric Wyndham beneath the light of a single lantern. Their proximity left nothing ambiguous. Wyndham's hand rested against Caelith's waist with the comfortable ease of someone who had been there many times before. And Caelith's expression, caught unguarded for perhaps the first time since Leoric had known her, carried a softness she had never once shown him. The confrontation afterward was brief and devastating. Caelith did not deny the betrayal. She did not apologize. She simply adjusted her composure the way someone might straighten a painting knocked slightly crooked by a passing wind. "You offered stability, Leoric. Edric offered something different. Surely you understand that women require both." Leoric said nothing. He turned and walked out of the estate without a word. The carriage ride home lasted 2 hours, and he did not move once during the entire journey. The public aftermath was merciless. London society consumed the scandal with appetites that revealed far more about the people spreading the gossip than the people involved. Women whispered behind opera glasses. Men exchanged knowing glances at gentlemen's clubs. Cartoonists published thinly veiled illustrations in satirical papers depicting a nobleman deceived by beauty wearing a mask. Corianne's reaction worsened everything, rather than comforting her son. She expressed frustration that the situation had been handled publicly rather than privately. "You should have managed the discovery with more discretion," she told him flatly over breakfast. Scandals damage families far longer than broken affections do. That sentence severed something between mother and son that never fully healed. In the months that followed, Leoric retreated into the operational machinery of the Ashvin estate with a thoroughness that concerned everyone close to him. He buried himself in ledgers, shipping accounts, tenant negotiations, and parliamentary correspondence. He attended social gatherings only when business required his presence, and spoke to women with a courteous distance, so consistent it became its own kind of armor. Rothwell, his trusted valet, who had served the Ashvane household since Aldwyn's time, watched the transformation with growing worry. "Your father did not build Thornhaven so his son could live inside it like a prisoner," Rothwell observed quietly one evening while setting out supper Leoric had not requested. "My father is not here to tell me what he built it for." The sharpness in Leoric's voice ended the conversation. Rothwell said nothing further, but left the supper tray beside the fireplace where it remained untouched until morning. Women continued pursuing Leoric relentlessly. His title, wealth, and brooding reputation created an attraction that seemed to intensify with every rejection he offered. Ambitious mothers arranged chance encounters at every event he attended. Young noblewomen laughed too brightly around him, complimented him too eagerly, and performed versions of themselves so polished that Leoric could see his own reflection in the surface of their pretending. None of it moved him. He had learned a lesson Caliph had taught without intending to. Charm was a costume. Warmth could be manufactured. And the people most desperate to be close to power were usually the ones least capable of offering anything genuine in return. Yet beneath the controlled surface of his daily existence, one quiet obligation continued pulling at him with a persistence he could not silence. His father's promise. Protect the girl. Whatever happens, you gave me your word. Leoric had kept the promise in the only way he knew how. He ensured Isanora was never dismissed. He instructed the steward privately to maintain her position regardless of household restructuring. He prevented his mother from acting on complaints about unnecessary staff without ever explaining why. But he had not spoken to Isanora directly in over 3 years. He passed her occasionally in corridors, aware of her lowered gaze and the worn gray dress that seemed designed to make her disappear into stone walls. He knew she worked harder than anyone else in the household. He knew the servants respected her. He knew his sisters treated her with casual cruelty that should have been stopped years ago. And he knew, somewhere beneath the layers of emotional withdrawal he had wrapped around himself since Calith's betrayal, that avoiding Isanora was not protection. It was cowardice. Because the truth Leoric would not yet admit to himself was simple and terrifying. Every time he passed her in those corridors, every time he caught a glimpse of her quiet steadiness or overheard a servant speaking about her kindness with genuine warmth, a feeling stirred that had nothing to do with obligation and everything to do with recognition. And inside the locked drawer of his father's desk sat a letter that would change everything the moment he found the courage to open it. Leoric received the message from Rothwell while reviewing shipping contracts inside a rented office near London's financial district. The note was brief. Rothwell was not a man who wasted words. Your mother has arranged for the girl's removal from the household. Transfer, scheduled by month's end. Staffing house in Caulfield. Thought you should know before it was done. Leoric read the message twice. Then he set it down on the desk, stood without speaking, and walked to the door. His assistant looked up from a ledger. Your Grace, the meeting with Lord Pemberton's agent begins within the hour. Cancel it. The carriage ride from London to Thornhaven took nearly 5 hours under good conditions. In heavy rain across muddy roads, it took closer to 7. Leoric spoke to no one during the journey. He sat motionless inside the carriage while water streamed down the windows and the wheels fought for grip against softened ground. Rothwell's message had not surprised him. He had known for years that his mother wanted Isanora removed. The surprise was the feeling that erupted inside his chest when he read the words, not irritation, not obligation, fury, raw, and unexpected. He arrived at Thornhaven as the afternoon light was failing behind thick gray clouds. The estate looked darker than usual in the rain, its stone walls glistening like wet iron, while water pooled in the gravel courtyard. Servants rushed to take his horse and coat, startled by an arrival nobody had expected. "Where is she?" Leoric asked the first footman who reached him. The man hesitated. "Your mother is in the morning room, Your Grace." "Not my mother, Isanora. Where is she?" The footman's expression shifted with visible discomfort. "I believe she is outside, Your Grace, behind the kitchens. She has been out there for some time." Leoric moved through the manor without stopping. He passed through the main corridor, through the servants' passage, through the kitchen where cook stepped aside in confusion, and through the rear door into the cold rain. He found her standing in the kitchen garden. Her dress was completely soaked. Her hair hung loose and dark against her face while rain fell steadily across her shoulders. Her hands hung at her sides, with the stillness of someone who had simply stopped trying to hold anything together. But she was not crying. Her eyes were open and fixed on something distant beyond the garden wall, like someone who had traveled somewhere inside herself that the rain could not reach. Leoric stopped several paces away. For a long moment he simply stood there, rain soaking through his own coat while he watched a woman who had endured years of silence, cruelty, and erasure standing alone in a storm with more dignity than anyone seated inside his warm, candlelit manor. A barrier he had spent years constructing cracked open inside him. Then Brielle's voice came from the kitchen doorway, sharp and urgent. "Isanora, come inside. Come inside right now. The Duke has returned." Isanora turned slowly. When she saw Leoric standing in the rain several feet away, something crossed her face that he could not immediately identify. Not relief, not fear. Something between recognition and exhaustion that made his throat tighten painfully. "Your Grace." Her voice was barely audible above the rain. "I did not know you were returning." "Neither did I." He held her gaze for 3 full seconds before turning toward the kitchen door. "Come inside, please." She followed him without argument, too drained to question anything. Brielle wrapped a thick wool shawl around Isanora's shoulders. The moment she crossed the threshold, while Tilly rushed forward with warm tea that had clearly been prepared, in hopeful anticipation, Leoric did not stay in the kitchen. He walked directly through the corridor toward the morning room where Duchess Corian was entertaining 2 remaining guests from the afternoon tea. He entered, without knocking. The room fell silent. Immediately. "Leave us," Leoric said to the guests. His voice was controlled, but the command beneath it permitted no negotiation. The 2 women gathered their things and departed quickly, while Corian straightened in her chair with the defensive composure of someone who had been expecting this confrontation, but not this soon. "You received word," she said flatly. "You arranged her removal without consulting me. She is a household servant, Leoric. I do not consult the Duke of Ashvane regarding the placement of kitchen staff." Leoric closed the door behind him. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have inside the quiet room. "You know she is not simply a kitchen servant. You have always known that. Father brought her into this household under his personal protection, and you agreed to honor that arrangement after his death." Corian's jaw tightened. "Your father made many sentimental decisions during his final years. Not all of them were wise. His decision to protect the daughter of a man who was destroyed by corruption was not sentimental. It was decent, silence pressed against every wall." Corian's voice dropped lower. "She serves no function here. She has no future within this family. Keeping her indefinitely out of loyalty to a dead man's wishes is not practical. It is indulgent." Leoric stepped closer to the desk. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet force that made his mother's hands tighten involuntarily against the armrests of her chair. "She stays. And if you attempt to remove her again, through staffing arrangements or any other method, I will make certain this entire family understands what Father kept hidden. And when they do, Mother, you will wish you had chosen silence tonight." Corianne stared at her son. Her expression shifted to reveal not anger, but closer to dread. Not fear of Leoric himself, but fear of whatever truth he was holding behind that sentence. "What do you mean?" Leoric held her gaze without blinking. "It means there are things about Isanora's presence in this house that Father never told you. And before this matter is finished, you will learn every single one of them." He left the room before she could respond. The door closed behind him, with a finality that echoed through the entire ground floor of the manor. That evening, after the household had fallen into uneasy silence, Leoric sat alone inside his father's study. Rain continued falling against the tall windows, while a single candle burned on the desk beside him. His eyes rested on the locked drawer. He had carried the key on a chain around his neck since the day his father died. Aldwin had pressed it into his palm during those final delirious hours, whispering instructions that were barely coherent through the fever. "When the time comes, you will know. Not before." Leoric wrapped his fingers around the small iron key and held it tightly while the flame flickered against the darkness. The time had come. 3 days after Leoric's return, Thornhaven Manor received an invitation that sent Duchess Corianne into a state of anxious preparation, usually reserved for royal visits. The Countess of Ashford was hosting a midsummer gathering at her estate in the neighboring county, and every prominent family within 60 miles had been summoned. Corianne immediately began organizing the family's attendance. 2 gowns were selected, carriages were inspected, seating preferences were communicated through letters dispatched that same afternoon. Then, Leoric made an announcement that stopped every conversation inside the household. "Isanora will attend the gathering, not as staff, as my guest." The silence that followed lasted long enough for candle wax to drip audibly onto a silver holder. Vashian was the first to recover. "You cannot be serious." Nerys looked physically ill. "People will talk, Leoric. You must understand how this will appear." Andrine said nothing, but stared at her brother with an expression that wavered between confusion and something dangerously close to jealousy. Corianne set down her teacup with a steadiness that required visible effort. "This is inappropriate. She is a servant in this household. Presenting her as a guest at Lady Ashford's gathering will humiliate this family publicly." Leoric looked at his mother calmly. "The only humiliation this family should concern itself with is how it has treated someone living under its roof for years." Nobody had a response. He left the room without waiting for one. That evening, Isanora stood inside her attic room while Brielle carefully adjusted a gown that had arrived that afternoon from a London dressmaker. Pale blue silk with delicate silver embroidery along the sleeves and hem. Nothing designed to compete with the diamonds and imported fabrics the Ashford sisters would be wearing, but it was the most beautiful thing Isanora had touched since leaving Moorcaster Hall a decade ago. "I do not understand why he is doing this," Isanora whispered, while Brielle fastened the last button along her back. Brielle met her eyes in the small cracked mirror, perhaps because someone should have done it years ago. The gathering at Ashford Hall was magnificent in ways that made Isanora's chest tighten with anxiety the moment their carriage passed through the entrance gates. Hundreds of lanterns hung from trees lining the approach. The great house blazed with golden light from every window, while music drifted across manicured gardens where guests strolled between marble fountains carrying crystal glasses. Inside the ballroom, enormous flower arrangements climbed white pillars toward painted ceilings. Tables overflowed with roasted lamb, honey-glazed quail, buttered asparagus, sugared berries, warm bread rolls, and towers of chocolate pastries dusted with gold leaf. The scent of jasmine, roasted meat, and expensive perfume filled the air so thickly it felt almost tangible. Isanora entered the ballroom beside Leoric while every member of the Ashfane family walked several paces behind them. The effect was immediate and seismic. Conversations faltered. Women turned with curiosity that sharpened rapidly into confusion. Men exchanged glances while trying to identify the unfamiliar woman walking beside one of the most powerful dukes in England. Vashtienne's face flushed with visible embarrassment. Nerys gripped her fan so tightly the wooden ribs creaked. Andrine positioned herself as far from Isanora as the ballroom allowed, but Leoric did not hesitate. He walked Isanora directly toward the center of the gathering and introduced her personally to the Countess of Ashford. "Lady Ashford, may I present Miss Isanora, a valued member of the Ashfane household, and my personal guest this evening." The Countess studied Isanora with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Then she smiled warmly. "Any guest of yours is most welcome, Your Grace. Please make yourself comfortable, my dear." It was the first time anyone of social standing had called Isanora my dear, since her father's death a decade earlier. The kindness in those two small words nearly undid her completely. Throughout the evening, Leoric remained near Isanora in ways that society understood instinctively. He brought her wine. He introduced her to guests whose opinions carried weight. He listened when she spoke and responded to her observations with genuine engagement rather than polite condescension. And Isanora, without intending to, revealed herself. She did not perform. She did not flatter. She did not laugh at remarks she found dull or compliment people she did not admire. When a retired naval officer discussed the economic impact of coastal shipping routes, Isanora contributed thoughtful questions that surprised him visibly. When a young woman expressed anxiety about an upcoming social debut, Isanora spoke to her so gently and honestly that the girl's shoulders relaxed for the first time all evening. She moved through the gathering the way her father had once moved through rooms, with quiet intelligence, genuine warmth, and absolutely no interest in impressing anyone for the sake of impression alone. Leoric watched her from across the ballroom during one of these conversations and felt something settle inside him with a certainty he had not experienced since before Salith destroyed his ability to trust what he felt. This was not obligation. This was not pity. This was something far more dangerous and far more real. By the end of the evening, whispers had already begun circulating through every carriage departing Ashford Hall. "Who is she? Did you see the way he looked at her? Surely she cannot be a servant. Something is happening inside that household." Inside the Ashford carriage returning to Thornhaven, silence sat heavily between every passenger. The sisters stared out opposite windows. Corianne gazed straight ahead with an expression carved from stone. Isanora sat with her hands folded quietly in her lap, still wearing the pale blue silk gown, still uncertain whether the evening had actually happened. And Leoric, seated across from her in the dim lamplight, studied her face with an expression she could not read, but that made her heart beat, in a way it had not beaten in a very long time. In the weeks following the Ashford gathering, life inside Thornhaven Manor shifted with the slow, grinding inevitability of tectonic plates rearranging beneath stable ground. Leoric began visiting the household library during afternoons when he knew Isanora took her brief rest between duties. At first, their conversations lasted only minutes. He asked which books she preferred. She answered carefully, still uncertain whether speaking freely to the Duke carried hidden consequences. But Leoric possessed a quality that disarmed her gradually and completely. He listened the way her father had once listened. Not waiting for his turn to speak, but genuinely absorbing what she said and responding to the substance rather than the surface. By the third week, their conversations lasted hours. They discussed philosophy beside tall windows while afternoon light moved slowly across the library floor. They debated historical events with a mutual seriousness that would have surprised anyone who still thought of Isanora as simply a maid carrying silver trays. She challenged his assumptions with a confidence that emerged naturally once she stopped expecting punishment for having opinions. "You disagree with me," Leoric observed one afternoon after Isanora had quietly dismantled his position on trade policy with 3 careful sentences. "Respectfully, yes." A smile crossed his face. The first genuine, unguarded smile Rothwell had seen from the Duke in over 2 years. Good. Leoric arranged for Eisenor's quarters to be moved from the attic to a guest room on the 2nd floor. He instructed the housekeeper to adjust her duties so she was no longer required to work before dawn or past evening supper. He ensured she received proper meals at the dining table rather than cold bread beside the kitchen doorway. Each change arrived with the quiet precision of someone correcting mistakes that should never have existed. Duchess Corian observed everything with growing alarm but said nothing directly to Leoric. Instead, she summoned her daughters. The meeting took place inside the morning room, behind closed doors, while Eisenor was occupied in the garden. Vashien arrived from the Callaway estate within 2 days of receiving her mother's urgent letter. Nerys had already been staying at Thornhaven while Lord Soren Marwick continued ignoring her correspondence. Andrine sat nearest the fire, twisting her engagement ring with anxious fingers. "This has gone far enough," Corian said with controlled fury. "He is publicly elevating a servant to a position that threatens this family's reputation. If society begins to believe he intends to marry her, we will become objects of ridicule." Vashien leaned forward. "Then we must remind him what she actually is. A charity case with no name, no fortune, and no standing." Nerys spoke more carefully. "Direct confrontation will not work. He has already demonstrated he will not yield to pressure. We need something more precise." The plan that emerged over the following hour carried the elegant cruelty of people who had spent their entire lives studying how society destroyed reputations. Nerys wrote a carefully worded letter to Lady Caelith Danter. The invitation was framed as a social gesture, a small autumn gathering at Thornhaven, an opportunity to reconnect with old acquaintances, nothing that would appear suspicious to Leoric, but every woman in that morning room understood the true purpose. Caelith still possessed the beauty and social confidence that made other women feel invisible by comparison. Placing her inside the same room as Eisenor would, they believed, remind Leoric of the difference between a woman worthy of his position and a girl wearing a borrowed gown. Caelith accepted the invitation within 3 days. She arrived at Thornhaven on a cool October afternoon wearing deep burgundy velvet, trimmed with gold thread, that caught the firelight as she entered the drawing room. Her dark hair was swept upward beneath ruby pins, and her confidence filled the room like perfume. Leoric's expression did not change when he saw her. He greeted her with the same courteous distance he offered every guest, then returned his attention to a conversation with Rothwell near the study entrance. Caelith's smile thinned almost imperceptibly. Throughout supper that evening, Caelith positioned herself expertly. She spoke about London theatre with practiced enthusiasm. She referenced memories from the years she and Leoric had spent together with a warmth designed to create the impression of lingering intimacy. "You always did prefer autumn evenings," she told him softly, while guests moved between the dining room and the drawing room after the meal. "Something about the way cold air sharpened your thinking." Leoric met her gaze steadily. "I prefer honesty over atmosphere, though I understand that distinction was never important to you." The words landed quietly but precisely. Caelith's composure held, but the confidence behind her eyes flinched. Across the room, Eisenor watched the exchange without speaking. She did not know who this woman was or why she had arrived, but she recognized the careful performance Caelith was delivering with an instinct sharpened by years of observing people from the margins. Later that evening, Nerys arranged for Eisenor and Caelith to be seated together during a card game. The intention was transparent: force Eisenor into direct comparison with a woman whose beauty, social ease, and aristocratic confidence would expose every gap between them. The plan failed completely. Eisenor played cards with quiet competence. She spoke when addressed, responded to Caelith's veiled condescension with patience rather than insecurity, and treated every person at the table with the same steady warmth regardless of their title. When a young guest accidentally spilled ink across the card table and began apologizing frantically, Eisenor calmed her with gentle humor, while Caelith visibly recoiled from the spreading stain. By the end of the evening, 3 guests had sought Isanora's company voluntarily. 2 had asked Leoric privately who she was, and Seelith departed the following morning without receiving the attention she had traveled to collect. But the sisters' campaign did not end with Seelith's failure. Vashien began spreading whispers through social channels suggesting Isanora had manipulated the Duke's emotions through calculated vulnerability. Nerys repeated these rumors in letters to influential women across 3 counties. Even Ondrine contributed by casually mentioning to Lord Keldon's family that her brother had developed an unfortunate attachment to a former servant. The gossip reached Leoric's ears within a week. Rothwell delivered the news reluctantly during a morning meeting inside the study. There are rumors circulating among several families that Miss Isanora has deliberately engineered your affection for financial security. The source appears to originate from within your own household. Leoric's jaw tightened. He set down the document he was reading with careful precision. That evening, he entered the drawing room, where all 3 sisters were seated together. Corienne was absent, having retired early with a headache that may or may not have been genuine. Leoric did not sit down. He stood near the fireplace and looked at each of his sisters in turn before speaking. I will say this once. Isanora has endured more cruelty inside this household than any of you have faced in your entire lives. She has never asked me for anything. She has never sought advantage. She has never spoken a single unkind word about any of you, despite having more reason than anyone I know. Vashien opened her mouth to respond.
I am not finished,
Leoric continued, his voice dropping to a quiet edge that silenced the room completely. If I discover that any member of this family has continued spreading malicious rumors about her character, I will personally ensure that every secret this household is desperately protecting becomes public knowledge, including the debts, including the betrayals, including the letters Lord Soren Marwick never answered. The color drained from Nerys's face. Vashien looked as though she had been struck. Ondrine lowered her eyes to the carpet. Leoric held the silence for several seconds before walking out of the room. That night, long after every light in the manor had been extinguished, Leoric sat inside his father's study beside a single candle. The locked drawer was open before him. In his hands rested a letter bearing his father's wax seal. He had broken it 2 hours ago. His fingers still trembled, because the letter did not simply explain why Alduin had brought Isanora to Thornhaven. It revealed something far more devastating. Gavrion Moorcaster's conviction had been built on forged documents. The forger had been hired by Lord Harith Velmire, and the man who had connected Velmire to the forger, the man who had facilitated the destruction of an innocent nobleman's life for political gain, was someone whose name Leoric recognized immediately, Lord Draven Calloway, Vashien's husband. The winter ball at Kensington House was the most exclusive social gathering of the season. Only families whose influence, wealth, and reputation met the highest thresholds received invitations. Crystal chandeliers the size of small carriages hung from ceilings painted with celestial scenes in gold and midnight blue. Marble floors reflected hundreds of candles like frozen pools of light, while orchestras played from balconies overlooking a ballroom so vast that voices echoed slightly between its distant walls. Long banquet tables carried silver platters of roasted venison with juniper glaze, poached salmon resting on beds of crushed fennel, braised pheasant with blackberry compote, creamed potatoes whipped with truffle oil, towers of sugared profiteroles, and crystal bowls of mulled wine that filled the air with cinnamon and clove. Every powerful family in England moved through the ballroom wearing enough diamonds to illuminate the room without candles. Isanora entered beside Leoric, wearing ivory silk embroidered with pale gold thread along the bodice and sleeves. Brielle had arranged her hair with simple elegance, weaving thin golden pins through dark curls that rested softly against her neck. She wore no diamonds, no rubies, no borrowed extravagance designed to compete with the wealth surrounding her. And she had never looked more striking. The effect of her entrance rippled outward through the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water. Whispers erupted between guests who recognized the Duke of Ashvane and could not identify the woman walking at his side. Fashian stood frozen against the far wall, her expression caught between fury and disbelief. Nerys gripped her champagne glass so tightly, the crystal stem threatened to crack. Andrine turned away entirely, unable to watch. Duchess Corienne stood near the ballroom entrance, motionless. She had not spoken to Leoric privately since the evening he confronted his sisters. The rigid certainty that had governed her decisions for years had begun fracturing into something unfamiliar. Doubt. Lady Calith Dantier was present as well, wearing midnight blue velvet with silver beading that caught the candlelight with every movement. She watched Leoric from across the ballroom with an expression that shifted between longing and resentment. For the first hour, Leoric moved through the gathering with measured calm, introducing Isanora to earls, countesses, members of parliament, and titled families whose approval could reshape a person's social standing overnight. Several guests responded warmly. Others studied Isanora with cautious curiosity. A few exchanged whispers that carried the sharp edge of skepticism. Then, as the orchestra paused between waltzes and the ballroom settled into a brief, expectant hush, Leoric stepped forward into the open center of the floor. Conversation stopped, glasses lowered. 300 pairs of eyes focused on the Duke standing alone beneath the largest chandelier. In the room, he turned toward Isanora, who stood near the edge of the ballroom, holding a crystal glass she had not touched once. Then he spoke. And every word carried across the silent hall. For 5 years, a woman has lived inside my household who was robbed of everything she deserved. Her father, Lord Gavrion Morecaster, was one of the most honorable men this country has ever produced. The name Morecaster sent a visible reaction through the ballroom. Older guests exchanged glances of recognition. Several women pressed gloved hands against their mouths. Lord Gavrion was convicted of fraud based on forged documents manufactured by men who sought his destruction for political gain. He died impoverished and alone. His daughter was left with nothing. Leoric paused while the silence deepened. My father, Duke Aldwin Ashvane, knew the truth. He brought Gavrion's daughter into our household to protect her from the men who had destroyed her family. He placed her among the staff to shield her identity, and on his deathbed, he made me swear to protect her. Leoric reached into his coat and produced a folded letter bearing a wax seal that several guests close enough to see recognized as the Ashvane crest. This letter, written by my father before his death, contains evidence that Lord Gavrion Morecaster's conviction was based entirely on forgery. It identifies the men responsible. Legal proceedings to restore his name and title have already been initiated. A murmur swept through the ballroom like wind through dry grass. Leoric turned fully toward Isanora. Her face had gone pale. Her hands trembled against the glass she was still holding. Tears had begun forming behind her eyes, but she had not yet released them. His voice softened, but it carried no less weight. For 5 years, Isanora lived inside my household and was treated as though she possessed no value. She was mocked, dismissed, humiliated, and ignored by people who never once asked who she truly was. He paused. But I did not fall in love with Isanora because of her father's title. I did not choose her because of the injustice she survived. The ballroom had become so quiet that the sound of candle flames flickering was audible from across the room. I chose her because in 5 years of cruelty, she never once became cruel in return, because she protected frightened servants when nobody was watching, because she carried herself with more dignity in a worn wool dress than most people in this room carry in diamonds, because she possesses a kindness so deep and so genuine that it survived everything this world threw against it without breaking. Leoric reached into his other pocket and produced a small velvet box. He opened it slowly. Inside rested a ring. Not the largest diamond in the room, not the most extravagant, but a clear, brilliant stone set in a simple gold band that caught the light with a warmth that felt somehow more honest than the glittering excess surrounding them. Isanora. His voice carried a steadiness that contrasted with everything trembling inside the woman standing before him. You have spent 10 years believing you were forgotten. You were not forgotten. You were never forgotten. And there is no woman in England I admire, respect, or love more than you. Tears spilled openly down Isanora's face. Her hands covered her mouth, while her shoulders shook with emotion she could no longer contain. A decade of grief, silence, loneliness, and invisible labor crashed against her chest with a force that buckled her composure completely. "Will you honor me by becoming my wife?" The sound that escaped her was not a word. It was the breaking of something that had held itself together for far too long. She nodded through the tears. Then her voice came barely a whisper that the nearest guests strained to hear. "Yes." The ballroom erupted. Applause swept through the hall in waves, while guests pressed forward with congratulations. Women dabbed their eyes with lace handkerchiefs. Men nodded with the kind of solemn approval reserved for moments they recognized as genuinely significant, rather than merely ceremonial. Lady Caliph turned and walked toward the exit. Vashtian stood frozen against the far wall, while something shattered behind her, carefully maintained expression. She had married Draven Calloway, believing his name carried honor. Now that name had been publicly connected to the destruction of an innocent man's life. Narration stared at her untouched champagne glass, while the realization settled slowly and painfully through her. She had spent years mocking a woman whose suffering had been caused by people Narissa herself had admired. Andrine lowered her eyes completely and did not raise them again for the remainder of the evening. And Duchess Corianne stood motionless near the ballroom entrance while tears rolled silently down her face. Not tears of pride, not tears of embarrassment, tears of recognition. She had spent years treating Gavrion Morcaster's daughter the way the world had treated Gavrion himself, with dismissal, with cruelty, with the quiet administrative erasure of someone she decided was worth nothing. And she had been catastrophically wrong. Years passed after that evening at Kensington House, and the world, as it always does, revealed the difference between lives built on appearances and lives built on something deeper. Isanora Ashvey, Duchess of Thornhaven, became one of the most quietly beloved figures in English society, not because of her title, not because of the dramatic proposal that London newspapers described for months afterward, but because of the way she carried kindness into every room she entered, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She remembered every servant's name. She visited tenant families during harsh winters, carrying blankets and food prepared by her own hands. She established a fund for children orphaned by industrial accidents and personally reviewed every application rather than delegating the work to administrators. When local families needed help navigating legal disputes they could not afford to fight, Isanora arranged quiet assistance through solicitors. She hired privately. When elderly workers on the Ashvane estates fell ill, she ensured their wages continued and their families received medical attention without being asked. People noticed. Not because she announced these things, but because genuine kindness, practiced consistently, becomes impossible to hide. Old Brielle remained at Thornhaven as the head of household staff, a position Isanora created specifically because no one understood the estate more deeply or cared for its people more fiercely. Brielle managed the servants with the same warmth she had always shown Isanora during those long, difficult years, and the household became known throughout the county as the finest place in England for staff to work. Tilly, the young kitchen girl Isanora had once protected from dismissal over a broken porcelain bowl, grew into a skilled pastry cook whose lemon tartlets became famous at Thornhaven gatherings. She never forgot who had taken the blame for her, and she never stopped trying to repay that kindness through her work. Halden, the elderly gardener, Isanora had nursed through a fever years earlier, continued tending the estate gardens until his hands could no longer hold shears. On his final day of work, Isanora walked beside him through every flower bed he had planted over 30 years while he named each variety from memory. She held his arm when his steps faltered and thanked him with words that made the old man cry for the first time in decades. Leoric himself changed in ways that surprised even those closest to him. The cold distance that had defined him for years after Kaila's betrayal softened gradually into something steadier and warmer. He smiled more frequently. He laughed occasionally, though always quietly, as though the habit was still returning after a long absence. He treated Isanora not as someone he had rescued, but as someone who had rescued him from a life spent hiding behind walls of his own making. Their first child, a daughter, was born on a spring morning while rain fell gently across the hills surrounding Thornhaven. They named her LOS, after the mother Isanora had lost at 7 years old. Lord Gavrion Morcaster's name was officially restored 18 months after the Kensington proposal. A parliamentary review confirmed that every document used in his conviction had been forged. Lord Hareth Velmeyer faced criminal proceedings that stripped him of his title and political influence. His co-conspirator, Lord Draven Calloway, was publicly exposed and financially ruined by the legal consequences. Vashian's marriage collapsed entirely. Draven's debts, betrayals, and now his criminal involvement left her isolated and humiliated before the same society that had once envied her wedding. She returned to Thornhaven 6 months after the scandal broke, arriving in a carriage that no longer bore the Calloway crest because the family could no longer afford to maintain one. Nerissa's pursuit of Lord Soren Marwick ended in silence. He eventually married a younger woman from a wealthier family, without ever responding to Nerissa's final letter. She spent the following year living alone inside a rented townhouse in Bath, attending fewer and fewer social events until society largely forgot she existed. Andrine's engagement to Lord Kaelden survived the scandal but transformed into something cold and transactional. Kaelden's controlling behavior worsened after the public embarrassment connected to the Ashvane family. Andrine wrote to Isanora once a brief letter that contained no apology, but carried between its careful lines the unmistakable weight of regret. Duchess Corianne remained at Thornhaven. Leoric did not ask her to leave, and Isanora never once suggested it. The relationship between Corianne and her daughter-in-law never became warm, but it changed in ways that mattered. Corianne stopped issuing commands through the housekeeper. She began addressing Isanora by name. And once, during a quiet afternoon, when Isanora was reading beside the nursery window while baby LOS slept, Corianne entered the room and stood silently near the door for a long time before speaking. "I treated you as though you were nothing." The words came slowly, as though each one required effort to push through years of pride that had calcified around her ability to apologize. "Your father deserved better, and you deserved better." Isanora looked up from her book. She studied the older woman's face and saw something she had never expected to find there. Honesty. Real, unguarded, painful honesty, from a woman who had spent her entire life believing vulnerability was weakness. Isanora closed the book gently. "Sit with me," she said. Corianne hesitated. Then she sat. They remained together in the nursery for nearly an hour, while rain tapped softly against the windows, and the child slept peacefully between them. Neither spoke much. But the silence between them felt different from every silence that had come before. Not empty, not cold, simply quiet in the way that rooms become quiet after storms have finally passed. One autumn evening, 3 familiar carriages arrived at Thornhaven Manor, carrying 3 women who had once filled its corridors, with mockery and laughter aimed at the girl in the gray dress. Their gowns were older now. Their faces carried exhaustion instead of pride. Their jewelry was simpler, their confidence diminished, their voices softer. Isanora received them inside the drawing room beside the fireplace while golden afternoon light fell through the tall windows. She offered them tea, warmth, and kindness, not because they deserved it, not because forgiveness had come easily, but because Isanora understood something her father had tried to teach her beneath an oak tree many years ago, something the world eventually confirmed in the most painful way possible. The only worth that survives anything is the kind that lives inside your character. Everything else can be taken overnight. And England learned slowly, through whispered conversations in drawing rooms and admiring words spoken at charity gatherings, and quiet stories shared between servants who had watched everything from the beginning, what the Ashvin family had discovered far too late, that the woman they had dismissed as nothing had always been the most valuable person in the room. And that true worth was never carried in diamonds, titles, or family names, but in the steady, unbreakable kindness of a heart that refused to become cruel, no matter how much cruelty the world placed upon it.